They hired me because I knew how to be invisible. I worked nights at the Basilica, patrolling marble corridors that smelled of candle wax, old books, and the cold iron of safes. My badge read Vatican security, but the truth was smaller and stranger. I guarded the basements, the service tunnels where pipes groaned and the light bent around forgotten doors. People there moved like souvenirs, careful and ancient. They did not shine flashlights into corners. They did not ask questions. My shift started at midnight and ended whenever the sun decided to push its way through the city. The ninth basement lived below everything, a muted world of cement and catalogued objects. Reliquaries wrapped in linen, crates stamped with Latin, crates that carried names no one spoke aloud. We called it the ninth because we counted from the crypts up, a dry joke that made the junior security guards laugh once and then stop when the senior men looked at them. I learned the routes, the odd sounds of each room, the safe hours when no one walked past the metal doors. I learned the list of forbidden things, and I learned names that were never to be written down in casual notes. Room 99 was a rumor when I first heard of it. Rumor became a rule the night I was issued the laminated card with my patrol circuits. Someone had taped a sticker over one of the floor plans, a neat square, and in block letters someone had written, "Do not look into room 99. The language was simple, the tone urgent. The card smelled faintly of cigarettes and incense. Father Pietro, a man who supervised the lower stacks and who always smelled like vinegar and prayer, handed it to me with a hand that trembled just enough to make me look away. "Never look," he said, and he did not sound like he was joking. "Never speak of it. Never point a camera. If you hear noise, report to the log. Do not go in, do not examine the door. You are not to have curiosity here." Curiosity becomes a kind of hunger inside those stones. Rules at the Vatican have a habit of sounding like scripture. When a directive comes from the custodial prefecture, it does not invite debate. I learned the difference between ordinary fear and the kind that arrives with authority behind it. The men who issued the rule looked at me as if the subject might stain me. I slid the card into my wallet and tucked my hands into my jacket pockets like a boy who had just swallowed a secret. On my third night alone in the ninth, I almost broke the rule. It was dumb luck. I was rounding a corner late, the corridor lined with storage cages, and my flashlight caught something at the far end. A rectangle of matte black where there should have been a simple door. The placard read 99 in brass numerals, slightly tarnished. The door was plain, no windows, no hinges visible. It wore the kind of silence that puts sound on hold. That silence felt like a promise and a threat. I wanted to keep walking. Part of me did. Another part of me had the old librarian's itch, the itch that made fingers flip through spines and pull ribbons out of old books. I stood there in the faint emergency light and heard something that was not a sound, yet it lodged itself in the bones of my hands. It was a soft scraping, like a fingernail over paper, a cadence that repeated and then stopped, patient as a metronome. Someone had told me not to look into room 99. They had not said what might happen if I did. I told myself I would not look, but I did. I bowed my head, just a little, peered at the keyhole. For a second the world narrowed to a pinprick. Inside the keyhole it looked as if something moved with intent, as if fingers had been waiting there behind the wood. My breath caught. A woman's voice said my name from somewhere beyond my own mouth, a whisper threaded with warning and welcome. I stepped back so hard I hit the cage railing. My flashlight skittered and went out, leaving me in a darkness that felt like fabric. The flashlight dying was the least of my problems. I fumbled in the dark, palms smacking metal, the sound loud as a bell in that quiet. When the spare bulb clicked into life, it threw the corridor into sharp relief. Room 99 stood there, utterly ordinary in the emergency glow, and yet the air around it seemed to bend. I told myself to move on. My feet did not obey. I had a habit of carrying an old digital camera on night shifts. Not sanctioned gear, just something to take inventory shots when labels were missing, or to document damage after a storm. It was a shallow indulgence, a way to prove the world existed when you worked in cellars that smelled of old wine and mildew. That night, without planning it, I thumbed the shutter and aimed the lens through the keyhole. I expected darkness and maybe a blur. What the screen showed made my throat go dry. The picture was not a room. It was a field. A wide, low plain under a sky that was not the sky of Rome. In the distance, shapes rose like ruined columns. In the center of the frame, someone stood with their back to the lens. They wore robes stitched with symbols I later found in the margins of forbidden ledgers. Their hair hung like damp rope. The figure turned, very slowly, and for a breath the camera captured a face that was not quite human. The eyes were too black, the mouth too small, but the expression was unmistakable. It smiled as if it had been waiting. My first instinct was to delete the image. My finger hovered over the trash icon and refused. The second instinct was to hide the camera in my jacket. I slid it beneath my shirt, the strap cold against my ribs, and backed away. The scraping sound whispered again from behind the wood, patient, like someone turning a page. I walked to Father Pietro's office along corridors I knew by rhythm. The old man was awake behind a mound of ledgers, his lamp burning like a steady heart. He smelled of vinegar and tobacco and something that might have been fear. I told him nothing at first. I handed him the camera as if offering a relic. He took it with hands that did not tremble. He viewed the photo without comment. His face tightened in a way I had seen when a manuscript turned up water-damaged, when a binding came loose and the text beneath it bled. He asked me where I had taken the shot. I lied about an upper storage corridor and inventory work. He watched me, the way someone watches when they know you are putting yourself at risk. Then he put the camera down and removed a drawer from his desk. From the drawer he pulled a single Polaroid wrapped in linen. The white border was browned with time. He unfolded it with reverence and placed it on the lamp-bleached table. The image showed a corridor with a door in the center. Brass numerals read 99, tarnished like the door I had seen. A man stood to the left of it, a janitor in a flat cap. The date scrawled on the back read 1984. Underneath, in a hand that was almost childlike, someone had written one word, "Not again." Pietro did not speak for a long minute. Then he tapped the Polaroid with a fingertip and said simply, "You must never tell anyone about this photograph. You must never show it to a camera. You must forget the picture you took." I asked why. He looked at me the way a shepherd looks at a boy who has found a fox in a henhouse and is tempted to pet it. "Because some things put their names into glass," he said. "And once a name is in a thing that records, it wants to be read." That night I lay awake with the camera under my pillow and the Polaroid in my pocket. My thumb rubbed the corner of the old photograph until the white blistered. I tried to imagine what the field in the digital image might mean. I tried to imagine how a room beneath the basilica could open onto a plane that belonged to another story. I knew one clear thing. The rule that had been taped onto my patrol map was not an idle warning. It was a containment. And by pointing a lens, however briefly, I had breached it. The Polaroid burned under my skin like a secret thumbprint. I kept it wrapped in linen as Pietro instructed, but I could not keep my hands off the archives. Curiosity is a job hazard when your work is to know what memory is stored where. The camera sat under my pillow and I pretended I slept. A week later I found the quiet file. It was misfiled in a drawer labeled Conservazione, a place for broken bindings and climate reports. The folder was thin and the outer tab had been smudged until the letters read only as a shadow. Inside were photocopies, fragile carbon copies, and a single-typed memo on prefect stationery stamped with a spiral eye. Someone had tried to erase the headings. Whoever had done it had not been very skilled. The first document was simple. An incident report dated March 12, 1984. The writer was the janitor whose Polaroid Pietro had shown me. His note was faint, as if written in a hurry. He described a sound behind a door in the 9th basement, a scratching like a nail over paper. He wrote that he saw light beyond the keyhole and that someone called his name in a voice that was both young and old. He swore he did not enter. He signed with a name I had never heard. The memo above his note carried a stamp, reviewed by Custodia, closed. A Xerox of a maintenance log lay below. The log recorded the door at 99 had been sealed 3 times that year. Each entry had a code number and a signature. CN 72, CN 84. CN meant Custodia Novum, a name whispered down the corridors like a cautionary prayer. I had only heard rumors, fragments in margins. The Custodia Novum were an internal order that no official history mentioned. They kept rooms and things that the rest of the church kept in stories. There were photographs too, grainy and small, of the same door on different days. In one, wax had been poured into the seam and a metal plate fixed over it. In another, a priest in a dark cassock stamped red wax into the plate as if sealing a ledger. The photos were unsigned. Someone had slipped them into the folder with care. The deeper I dug, the more the file stitched a pattern. A list of names written in a ledger fold. Dates of disappearance linked to nights when the seal had been weakened. A typed letter from a prefect requesting funds for temporal stabilization devices, with the blunt conclusion, "The room does not accept most forms of surveillance." I read that line 3 times. The room does not accept most forms of surveillance. It sounded like an excuse and like an instruction. My own Polaroid lay between 2 reports someone had filed under evidence. Image 99A. Someone had annotated the margin. Not again. The handwriting matched the scribble on the back of the old Polaroid. There was a smear of dark wax on the corner. Whoever assembled this folder had believed it important enough to hide in conservation rather than the custody vault itself. That told me 3 things. First, the Custodia Novum had records that leaked. Second, someone wanted these pages to be found. Third, danger had been documented and then shelved. The last document was a personal letter, folded many times, addressed only to the watcher. The writer begged for rotation, for mercy, for the removal of a name that had been placed in the registry. He signed with initials and a date decades old. Across the top someone had typed, in capital letters, "Forbidden." The word looked like a brand. When I closed the folder, I realized the camera under my pillow had started to vibrate. A new image had arrived, or perhaps my fingers imagined it. The vibration was a rhythm I could not name, but it matched the cadence in the maintenance log. My coin, the one Pietro had given me when I first started, felt suddenly warm in my pocket. I told myself I would walk away. I folded the photocopies and slipped them into my coat. The spiral eye on the prefect stamp seemed to look back at me from the paper. In the corridor, the lights hummed with a low current, like a throat clearing before speech. The safe thing would have been to return the file and forget I had seen it. I did not do the safe thing. At the stairwell, I paused. From below came a noise like a hand sliding across ledger paper. Not someone shuffling pages. A single steady scrape, slow and patient. I should have left then and sealed the drawer with my own hands. Instead, I pocketed the Polaroid, tucked the memo into my jacket, and walked toward room 99. I told myself this time I would be careful. That was a lie I had been rehearsing since the first photo appeared under linen. The folder burned a hole in my coat as if the paper itself wanted free air. I walked the familiar path to room 99 with the light low and my breath measured, because measured breath makes fewer mistakes than frantic lunging. The corridor was quieter than usual. Even the pipes seemed to listen. The door did not look different until I was near enough to read the brass numerals. 99. The metal bore fresh scratches, crosshatch marks someone had scored into the plate in the last week. The wax seal in the seam had split along one edge like a crack in old porcelain. Someone had tried to open it and failed. Or someone had pried it, then resealed it badly. Either way, an edge of vulnerability showed itself like exposed flesh. My fingers hovered over the seam and found that the plaster gave slightly. The sound that rose from behind the wood was not the scraping next I had learned to expect. It was softer, as if someone inside was turning pages slowly and with purpose. A draft lifted the hair on my arms, bringing with it the faint smell of grass after rain. It did not belong in a cellar. It did not belong beneath Rome. I pressed my ear to the cold wood. The sound shifted. For a moment I thought I heard laughter under the pages. Then a voice spoke a single syllable, not loud enough to form a word but full of memory. It was the same cadence that had threaded the janitor's note and the prefect's memo. It felt like being acknowledged by something that had been cataloging you for years. I did the stupidest thing possible. I reached into my pocket and drew the camera, palms slick with sweat. The strap rubbed against my knuckles. I aimed through the keyhole and peered at the tiny screen. The image that showed up made my stomach twist. Where the lens had captured a plane before, now there was a corridor much like the one I stood in, but not the same. It stretched farther and bent wrong, perspective folding on itself, as if someone had folded a page and tried to make one corridor be two. A form stood in that corridor too. It was close enough that the camera caught the detail of fabric, the hem of a robe stained with something like rust. The figure held up a hand. In the live image it moved toward the keyhole, and for a second the camera recorded the exact motion of a finger pressing in from the other side of the wood. My heart shoved against my ribs. I could have sworn I felt a pressure on my palm where the camera rested, a reflection of the pressure on the other side. The wax in the seam shivered. A hairline gap opened where the plate had been cracked. Light leaked through the crack, the color of wet grass. The keyhole turned as if watched by invisible hands. Then the worst thing happened. The camera slotted photo and flashed on its own. The shutter made a sound that felt like a judgment. I dropped the camera. It hit the stone with a soft thud and skittered under a storage cage. For a second I thought the room would swallow it and my footfall. I crawled after the device, hands scraping grit. When I pulled it free the screen was blank, a dead mirror. The image had been recorded and erased, or perhaps carried off. Either notion meant I had a problem. Footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor. Not the slow ledger scrape, but deliberate boots, someone moving with the authority to own midnight. I straightened, pressing the Polaroid against my chest. The slip under linen felt like a talisman and a trap at once. A shadow fell across the doorway and then a figure stepped out. He was not the guardian I had imagined. He wore no cassock and no badge. His jacket was patched with swatches of ledger paper like the guardian's, but his hands were calloused and clean, the hands of someone who moved with permission. He looked at me without surprise and said, as if reading a file I had not opened for myself, "You have the photograph." I wanted to lie. I wanted to say I had found it in a misfiled drawer. Instead I admitted the truth. I handed him the Polaroid. He palmed it like someone handling a relic and then folded it back into linen. "You saw the field," he said. His voice carried the flatness of someone who had learned not to let wonder arrange his face. "You focused on the wrong world." He tilted his head toward the cracked seal. "We have been mending this for decades. Cameras make names permanent. They are hungry for being read." The corridor lights hummed around us. I wanted to ask what he meant by hungry. I wanted to ask who had first broken the seal. I wanted to know whether the field and the corridor were the same thing at different times or two entirely different economies of being. The man watched my face with the patience of someone who had seen these questions before. "You must choose one rule tonight," he said. "Either you walk away and forget the image, or you come with me and learn to close what the lens opened." He extended his hand. In it rested a small object wrapped in linen and red string. It looked like a coin, like the kind of token Pietro had passed to me when I first started. It glinted under the emergency light, and when I looked closer I saw the spiral eye etched into its face. His hand was steady. The coin felt like a promise and a warning, heavy with history. I had expected coercion, a shouted command, or a threat carved in Old Latin. Instead the man spoke softly, as if lowering the volume might keep some things from waking. "We do not recruit," he said. "We apprentice. The choice is the same, but the difference is mercy." I almost laughed at mercy then. The word tasted thin in my mouth, like water poured over hot iron. Still, the corridor smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper now, a household scent that tried to make the moment domestic and failed. He folded the Polaroid back into its linen pouch and tied the red string with 2 swift knots. Then he offered the coin. "You can go back to your rounds," he said. "You can burn the camera and forget the photograph. Or you can accept the token and come down to the registry. Learn. Close the openings. Keep score." "You mean join the Custodia Novum?" I asked, because the phrase had been a rumor and now it loomed like a room. He inclined his head. "Titles matter less than practice. We have names for what we do, but what matters is the work. The ledger must be tended. Some people think the room is a trap. It is not. It is a ledger made manifest. It remembers. It is susceptible to recording and to being read. That is its weakness and its hunger." I thought of the janitor's note, the Polaroid stamped "not again," Pietro's lined face when he said forget the picture. I thought of the scraping that had followed me through the archives like a patient animal. I thought of Mara Bellotti, and the photograph with her looking past the camera. I thought of the coin's spiral eye etched into metal, a mark I had seen stamped on prefect memos. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. The man's jaw tightened. "Refusal is a kind of leaving. The ledger will reweave your threads without you. You will return, perhaps, but in pieces. Pietro told you his wife did not remember him at first. That is the currency of the room. It does not take life. It takes recognition. Recognition. The word arranges itself into an ache. To be recalled only in parts. To be owned by the memory of others. I imagined coming back and finding faces that mistook me for someone else. I thought of forgotten birthdays and misfiled bank accounts and a street that had become a bookbinder. The idea of being erased in increments felt crueler than any direct violence. I will learn, I said before I had decided. The coin was cool against my palm as soon as I closed my fingers around it. He nodded, as if he had simply been waiting for an affirmative. We walked under the basilica in the parts no tour knows. He led me past stamped crates and storage cages, past a room where reliquaries hummed like dormant instruments, until we reached another door that did not appear on any map. He pushed a brass plate and the lock sighed. Inside, a small office lit by green-shaded lamps waited. Shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled boxes, ribbon-bound ledgers, and jars of odd contents. A corner held a reel-to-reel player and a stack of tapes wrapped in wax. "This is where you begin," he said. "First lesson. Never document what you do not intend to keep. Cameras make names permanent. Do not show the room to a lens. Second lesson. A ledger can be amended, but only by those bound to it. Third lesson. There are ways to close an opening once it has been read, but they require ritual, paperwork, and witnesses." He fed a tape into the player and let it run. A voice I did not know spoke into the dust-burdened mic. It was a testimony from someone listed as returned. He spoke of waking up with memories that belonged to other people, of days that rearranged themselves, of the slow erosion of recognition. He ended with a plea for kindness. As the tape hissed to a stop, the man looked at me and said, "Do you understand the obligation?" I did. I did and I did not. The coin in my pocket is warm. The corridor outside is as quiet as a sealed book. I am here to be instructed. I am here to learn the proper way to shut a door that thinks in language, to reseal wax that leaks memory, to return photographs to linen and bury them under files. I am here to carry the ledger's small cruelty and try, with the tools they give me, to soften its edges for the next person who might otherwise be folded away. They did not throw me straight into the worst of it. The Custodia Novum operates like any bureaucracy that has survived centuries. There are forms, processes, and small humiliations meant to keep your head clear. I learned to respect the paperwork. I learned to fear the silence between one stamped page and the next. My first assignment arrived in a heavy folder marked with a strip of wax. The wax bore the spiral eye, pressed in red as old blood. Inside was a checklist typed on vellum in a careful hand. It read, in plain language I had not expected, what needed to be done to patch a leak in the room seam after an unauthorized exposure. Step 1. Inventory the evidence. Step 2. Archive master record under linen. Step 3. Perform the sealing rite at dusk. Step 4. Submit witness testimony to registry. Step 5. File the closure report and accept rotation. Bureaucratic comfort. Ritualic bite. They paired me with a woman named Alessia. She had been apprenticed longer and moved through the registry like a librarian who knows which books bite. Her hands were steady, scarred at the knuckles by too many keys. She explained the aim without drama. The camera image I had taken had been a reading. Readings invite responses. The room answers. Our job was to close that loop. We worked slowly and meticulously. First we gathered the artifacts. The Polaroid, now wrapped again in linen, seemed heavier. The camera, tapped and checked by Pietro, was locked in a lead-lined box. We catalogued both under a code that would look ordinary if lifted by a casual eye. The lead-lined box went into a cold chest. The Polaroid went into a drawer that smelled like old leather and cedar. Alessia taught me the precise motions for wrapping linen. There is an art to folding paper so it refuses the light. There is a science to knotting strings so seals hold through storms and years. We used a thread made of horsehair ribbon from an old binding and dipped it in a solution whose recipe I would be forbidden to tell. The scent was lemon and iron. As we worked, she recited a passage from a journal whose margin notes traced the same line as the prefect's ledger. Memory adheres to inscription, and inscription can be obscured. Then the ritual. They do not call it an exorcism. They call it a patch. Patches do not have dramatic gestures. Patches are signatures. We took the Polaroid to the seam, the same crack I had seen, and set it within a shallow bowl. We lit 3 candles that flickered with blue flame. Alessia played a tone on a small reed flute. The sound was a key more than music, a pitch that made my teeth buzz and the hairs on my forearms stand to attention. I followed the checklist. We spoke the words written on the vellum. They were procedural and precise, not prayers. They sounded like inventory notes that had been made holy by repetition. At the line that required a witness, Alessia bowed and called Pietro from his desk. He came without surprise. He placed his hands near, not touching, and nodded. Then we sealed. The wax was hot and thick. Alessia pressed the spiral eye into it, and the impression held like a fingerprint. The crack closed. The green light at the seam dimmed to an ember. For a moment I felt nothing but the hum of sealed paper and the cup of candlelight. Afterwards, there is always paperwork. Pietro wrote the witness line. Alessia filled the closure report, checking boxes with a calm that felt like prayer. I signed as the attendant. My script trembled. The registry accepted the file and slid the packet into a slot that swallowed it soundlessly. That night as I left the office, Alessia pulled me aside and said, gently, "You did good. But remember this. Patching does not erase reading. It only quiets echo. The camera holds a name now in 2 places. If that name finds a mouth, it will ask for a reading again." I held the coin in my pocket. It felt less like a token and more like a watch that counted down different hours. The Polaroid was sealed behind lint and lacquer. The camera sat in its lead box. The light along the corridor returned to its ordinary yellow. Yet when I passed room 99 I felt observed, like a ledger that had added a line in a new, too intimate column. I had helped close a breach. I had also become a witness on record. We filed the closure report under code CN 84 and the registry returned to its low hum. I slept, but sleep was always thin after a patch. In the small hours I dreamed of a field beyond the keyhole and a face that smiled like a promise. I woke with the taste of ash in my mouth and a new line in my ledgered life. The day after the patch felt like the morning after a storm. Light came through the archive skylights thinner, the sounds in the corridors flatter. People moved as if their limbs had grown new memory. I told myself that was normal, that sealing a seam under stone could not rearrange the world above. I was wrong. Small things changed first. The junior archivist who had handed me a stack of invoices now addressed me by a name I did not have. He called me Matteo for a full minute before realizing his mistake and blushing as if he had misfiled his manners. At a cafe near the Basilica, the barista asked if I was there to pick up a book I had never ordered. Phone numbers I had used for years began returning strings of silence. One email account closed with a polite auto-response, as if someone in a distant office had decided my address no longer merited a mailbox. Pietro said this was to be expected. He used the phrase slow unravel. The registry does not erase with spectacle. It erases like water wearing stone. A person becomes a set of missing references that everyone notices eventually and then accepts. When you live in a place organized by memory, losing recognition is like losing your address in the city. Doors stay closed. That morning I went back to room 99 because the work of patching does not end when wax cools. There are audits, cross-checks, filings to be reconciled. I wanted to see the photograph window. The cabinet doors were closed. The reel-to-reel player hummed idle. Alessia met me in the corridor and did not ask how I slept. Instead she handed me a thin envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with my handwriting on it. I had no recollection of writing the note. It read, "Remember to file closure report CN 84. Beneath it someone had added, in a hand I did not recognize, "Watch your pocket." My coin had been warm the whole morning. Now it trembled as if amused. I put it in my mouth for a moment to test the metal, an old habit I could not explain. It tasted like iron and lemon. The consequences of being noticed reached beyond social misrecognition. The camera incident had left a mark. We had patched one seam, but the image I took had not been destroyed. Pictures are records that like to be read. A photograph lives in 2 places, the capture and the person who remembers the capture. Even wrapped in linen, the Polaroid exhaled something like a rumor. At lunch I opened the packet Pietro had given me and found a photocopy of a letter from 1971. It was from a prefect to another cleric, and in blunt lines it described the same problem we had just sealed. He recommended creating a rotation, a list of attendants who could minister to the registry and act as official witnesses. He warned of the appetite of cameras and the danger of names written into resistant media. The memo ended with a directive I would learn to respect. Keep always 3 witnesses. Seal always with 2 hands. Never allow a lens unaccompanied. 3 witnesses. I had been one. Alessia, Pietro, and I had performed the sealing. The registry accepted the evidence. But cameras are not witnesses in the way our records were. They bear their own testimony and they do not tire. That afternoon, as I walked past a storage cage, the metal grate cast a shadow that looked like a hand. I felt a flicker of panic. Inside the cage someone had taped a tiny photograph so it hung from a rusty nail. It showed a field. Not the archive floor. A wide plain with distant columns. The same plain my camera had captured. Someone had hung it there as a warning or a taunt. The image was small, but the room noticed. The spiral-eye tiles shifted in sympathy. Alessia saw me stop and did not speak. She only nodded once. In that nod was both reassurance and a reminder. Sealing a seam buys time, not forgetfulness. That night I wrote a list of names I loved. I penciled the faces of my sister and the dog I had as a child. Then I folded the paper and slipped it into a book I would carry with me forever. It felt childish and useful. If recognition can be stolen slowly, then keeping a private ledger might be a small defense. The registry marks what it remembers. I marked what I must not let be taken. The small photograph hung in the cage like a dare. It bothered me more than the cracked wax or the cold seams because it proved that someone else had seen the plane and chosen to leave proof. Who would risk that, and why paste it in a place meant to be private? The question landed in my chest like a stone. That evening the ledger demanded an audit. Alessia called it a reconciliation. A ritual of accounting that kept histories from curdling into rumor. The central cabinet opened and we gathered the closure report CN 84, the witness statements, the wax impressions, and the inventory list. A senior from the prefect's office signed off on the forms with a hand that did not shake. The paperwork was ceremonial but necessary. Paper is the way the registry argues with itself. When the senior left, Pietro stayed behind and slid a thin envelope across the desk toward me. Inside was a photocopy of a different Polaroid, one I had never seen before. It showed a doorway with the brass numerals polished bright, but in the fold of the image, someone had captured a reflection. You could see the corridor, the door, and very faintly, pressed against the glass of the photographer, a second face. The back of the photograph had a note in trembling ink. Returned, 1995. A stamp read reviewed CN 95. You should not have taken a photograph, Pietro said quietly. He did not scold. He stated a fact like a meteorologist noting a storm. You must know what returning means now. I did. It was not death. It was unmaking by attrition. It was waking in streets that no longer held your name. It was being greeted by neighbors who only half-seated your memory. It was marriage letters that mistook you for a stranger. Pietro folded his hands and told me the story of a clerk who had been returned and then watched his own children call another man father. The man had left a testimony on a reel-to-reel, but the testimony itself had been reclassified and placed in conservation. Only an apprentice with patience and access could hear it now. Alessia pressed her thumb to the spiral-eye coin in my palm. There are patterns, she said. Not just in who the room chooses but how it chooses. It loves certain mediums. It favors photographs. It hungers for witnesses who do not understand their hunger. That night I slept with the private ledger I had hidden in my coat. I had started it as a joke, a list of small human anchors, the name of my sister, the dog, a bench in a nearby park where I knew the birdsong. Now it felt like a prayer book. I added Pietro's name and folded the page again. I imagined the ledger above the room running its fingers through my handwriting and deciding whether my anchors mattered. 2 days later there was a break. The lead-lined box that held the camera had been opened. The clasp was unbroken but the interior was empty. Whoever had taken the device had not left a fingerprint. The maintenance log recorded no entry. The surveillance cameras that covered the service corridors had static at key moments, footage corrupted in a way that looked like wet ink smeared by a hand. Someone had methodically taken away the tools that recorded. Without the camera there was no easy proof, only memory and the record we made by hand. I felt exposed. The room responded, as if it heard my anxiety. The spiral-eye tiles around the cabinet pulsed a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The mosaic underfoot felt suddenly like a compass pointing inward. I found a new photograph tucked under the drawer where we kept witness slips. It had not been there when I signed the closure report. The image showed a man at the center of the plane, arms raised. The back bore a scrawl I knew well. Not again. Beneath the scrawl someone had stamped a notation in red. Attempted breach, 4. The registry had records of attempts to reopen the seam. Attempts that were not always clean. When I traced my finger along the margin of the photograph, I felt the paper tremble, like a living thing hearing its name. For the first time since I accepted the token and the training, doubt was not abstract. It sat in my mouth, bitter and heavy. We had closed a seam. We had filed the forms. The room kept its accounts. Yet something or someone wanted that plain read, wanted its image spread. I slept badly. In the half-light of pre-dawn, I woke to the sound of distant pages being turned, a patient shuffling that came from below the floor. The ledger at my bedside had opened on its own to a blank page. My handwriting stared back at me. Someone, somewhere, was adding a line. The new photograph lay on my desk like an accusation. Morning light slanted through the high window and caught the paper in a way that made the plane look real enough to step into. I could almost smell the distant grasses. The red stamp read, "Attempted breach. 4. Someone had tried to pry the seam open again and had left this as a calling card or a dare. Whoever hung the tiny image in the cage wanted us to know they had been there. I started asking questions in the quiet way we are allowed to ask questions in the ninth. Not loud, not obvious. I moved through the archive like water through reeds, letting my hands touch the spines that knew the most. I spoke to the junior clerks, to the conservators, to a man who restored seals with the patience of someone mending bone. In a corner office I found a record no one had indexed properly, a file labeled in pencil, half erased, Lector Humoris. The Lector of Humidity. It read like a joke until I turned the page. Someone had been cataloging readings. Not ledger entries. Readings. Frequencies, optical anomalies, the odd behavior of photographs and film. The file contained dry charts and a list of names. Many had been marked returned. Many were annotated with short notes about how recognition had shifted. There was also a scrap of paper with a single sentence. The reader moves where the room listens most. The note had been folded into the margin of an old invoice. I traced the trail and it led me to a small chamber behind a false wall in the conservation wing. The room was thick with dust and the smell of chemical baths. Shelves held devices with names no one used in polite conversation. Under a glass dome rested a machine like a camera and a gramophone had been welded together. Wires curled like sleeping worms. On a stool next to it someone had left a loose notebook. Its pages were full of tiny handwriting and diagrams. At the top of the first page was a name I had not expected. Matteo Rinaldi. My name. My throat went dry. The entry below it detailed observations about seams and the kinds of light that made the registry respond. The hand had dated the notes decades ago. Someone who had once been me, or who had my name, had been studying how to read the room long before I arrived. The notebook was filled with experiments and ethical margins. A sheet tucked behind it contained a photograph of a man I recognized only from a black and white portrait in the prefect's office. He had been a lector, a reader, a bridge between what the room wanted and how the world kept accounts. I heard footsteps in the corridor and slid behind a shelf. A figure entered the chamber, moving carefully as if he did not want to wake the dust. He wore no badge, but his shoulders carried the bearing of someone who had kept rules for a very long time. He did not startle when he saw me. Instead he smiled with a kind of weary relief. "You found Matteo's notebook," he said. I stepped out from the shadow. The man was older than I had imagined. His eyes were kind and very tired. He introduced himself as Father Anselmo. He had the quiet authority of a man who had argued with memory and lost on occasion. He had been a lector once, he said, a secular reader who had taken refuge in the Custodia Novum when his curiosity became dangerous. "People read the room and the room reads back," Anselmo said. "Some days it is a ledger. Some days it is a trap. The two can be the same." He pointed to the folded scrap where Matteo Rinaldi had written observations. He studied how images anchor the seam. He left instructions to tier photographs when necessary. He left a method to treat returning with care. But he also left a warning. If you learn too well, you begin to think the ledger is compassion. I asked him who the attempted breacher might be. He shrugged. Readers in the dust. Smugglers of image. Some think they can free the plane by flooding it with sight. Others are messengers trying to bait the ledger. Either way, the room answers when invited. He pulled a thin envelope from his coat and slid it across the table. Inside was a list of names, faint and folded. At the top of the list was a name I did not know. At the bottom, in a hand I recognized from the back of my own notebook, was mine. "You are on the list not because you signed," Anselmo said quietly, "but because you listened. The ledger does not choose without rumor. It feeds on being told. You must decide how much you tell it back." The coin in my pocket felt like a second heart. The photograph on the desk seemed to breathe. I realized then that the attempted breach was not merely an act of defiance. It was an argument, left in images, daring the custodia to answer. And the room was listening. Anselmo folded his list and looked at me as if he measured my years with the same patience the ledger measured names. He said one thing I had not expected. The attempted breach was not an act of malice only. It was a question posed to the room, a test of whether the registry would answer in violence or in code. The photograph someone had hung in the cage was a provocation. It wanted to know what the ledger preferred, to be read or to be obeyed. That night the corridor smelled of rain though the sky was clear. I carried Matteo Rinaldi's notebook like contraband. Pages rustled as if relieved to be awake. Alessia met me at the small office and handed me a ribbon of thread dipped in the sealing solution. Pietro slid a witness slip across the desk and did not speak. We all knew the form of the ritual as we had been taught: acknowledgement, containment, amendment. We had patched seams, folded Polaroids into linen and buried them in official drawers. We had signed closure reports and watched the room accept them with the quiet of a ledger approving a footnote. But a breach is not sealed by ceremony alone. It requires a final reading. Someone must look and name the image, and then bind it with ink and witness so the registry has a new story to hold. The choice fell to me because my coin had warmed when the photograph arrived and cooled when I touched the ledger, the same metal rhythm as a heartbeat refusing to be anonymous. We went to room 99 together. The crack in the wax had widened by a hair. Green light leaked like a secret. The photograph we had retrieved from the cage was small but fierce. It smelled faintly of field grass. Alessia hugged it in linen and set it on the shallow bowl. Pietro placed his hand near the seam without touching. Anselmo opened Matteo's notebook to the page that sketched a pattern of stitching and sound. "Read it slowly," Anselmo said. "Name what you see, then write it down exactly. If you embellish, the ledger will eat the facts. If you refuse, the ledger will make them into absence." I steadied my hand. My voice was a stranger in my throat. I spoke the words Matteo had noted, names of light and weather and distance. I said the number of pillars, the taste of the wind, the color of the sky. I said the shape of the robe, the way the mouth curved like a promise. Each time I named something, Alessia scored it into the closure report. Pietro stamped the wax. The room listened as if it took each syllable as currency. When I reached the line about the face, I faltered. The photograph's mouth seemed to move, and not with the stillness of paper. I imagined the field opening and a tide of eyes turning toward me. I thought of Pietro's returned testimony, of his wife's slow forgetting. I thought of the ledger balancing itself with quiet cruelty. I wrote the final line anyway. I wrote, "The face smiles like one who has waited for names." I felt the ink sink into the paper as if sealing something under skin. Alessia folded the linen and wrapped the Polaroid. Pietro pressed the spiral eye into warm wax. The seam closed with a soft shudder like a breath ending. The green light dimmed to a stubborn ember. When we walked back through the corridor, the world felt altered in the small ways the registry had taught me to expect. A clerk called me by a name I recognized. The bookbinder still worked the same bench outside the basilica. Some things returned to being ordinary. Others did not. Later, alone in the office, I reread Matteo's notebook. In the margin, in a hand that might have been mine in another life, was a note I had missed before. The reader becomes the ledger's hand. Be careful which lines you scribe. I understood then the final truth. By naming the photograph, I had not only closed a seam. I had bound the image to a file that would be carried and used. We had prevented an indiscriminate opening. We had also added one more record to the registry that would decide, in its slow arithmetic, who the city would remember. That night the coin burned warm against my palm. I put it back on the desk and let it cool. I lit a candle and added 2 more entries to my private ledger, the childish list I kept like a prayer. I numbered them carefully. I do not know if my choice saved a life or rearranged a life into absence. I only know the ledger keeps accounts and the room listens to names. There will be other photographs. There will be other faces. Someone will always try to see what the room hides, and someone will always be given the coin to bind what is seen. The Custodia Novum taught me how to close, and they taught me what it costs to close. If curiosity makes you human, then this work makes you something else, an archivist of forgetting. I sat in the green light until dawn and wrote my name at the bottom of the page, steady as a signature on a will. Then I signed again, and the ink did not blot. Outside, the city turned. Someone hummed on a street I used to walk. My sister called a number that did not reach me. The ledger keeps pages, and I keep watch. I am not the only reader in the dust, but I am one who knows how to write the last line, and for now that knowledge is both a burden and a kind of mercy.